So why is rent on a property so much? Why does it cost so much to rent a house or an apartment or a condo? Well, let's take a look at some simple math, and whether you are a tenant or property owner or landlord or property management company, it's important to understand the math that goes into rent. And even as a tenant, even if you feel like your rent is too high, maybe it is too high, maybe it's overpriced, but understanding how that rent was calculated is important, because if you can see that the rent rate is required by the market, at least you'll know where you stand and you can start making arrangements and not just think that you can maybe find another property that might be cheaper, because all properties might be this much. Let's take a look at a typical single family house, right? And in most parts of the country, a single family house that is offered for rental might be $200,000 or $250,000. There's some parts of the country you can't even touch a property for $200,000. Every house is $400,000 or $500,000. And we'll talk about those. But let's just start out with a $200,000 property. And you can see we have two calculators here, one for the running total, one for each segment. And right now, interest rates are about 7.5%. So if you do 7.5%, that gives you $15,000 a year in interest on that property. Divide that by 12, and that gives you, right off the bat, $1,250 just for your taxes. So let's put that on the right-hand side. What else do you have to pay? Well, you're also going to have to pay for property tax. If you have a property that's $200,000, in most parts of the country, you're going to pay taxes about, well, let's say 1.5%, right? Because that's going to be a property tax rate. That's $3,000. Let's call that, let's add on to that, $250 a month on average for your taxes. You're also going to have to pay insurance for a residential rental property, not primary ownership. Most parts of the country, you're going to spend about 1 to 1.5% of the property value for your insurance policy. So let's add on another $250 a month for your insurance. Well, already you're at $1,750. Okay, so if you have a rent that's $2,500, you're in the ballpark, and you might say, well, they're making profit. Well, not really. How come? A property is going to need regular maintenance, upkeep, and improvements. It may not need it every day, every month, but even things like the roof has to be done every 20 years, and the air conditioner or heater needs to replace every 10 years. Most rule of thumb says that you have to spend about 2% to 3% per year on maintenance. So let's take that same $200,000 property and let's multiply it times 2.5%. Let's split the difference, right? That's going to give you $5,000. So divide that by 12 months. That gives you $416. Let's round it off to $400. Let's add on $400 to your total. Where are you at now? Now you're at $2,150. Okay, $2,150. When you rent a property, there's also an expense called vacancy factor. About every 2 years, on average, you'll have 1 month where you won't collect rent because you're going to have a tenant move in, move out, and sometimes you can time it where they move out on the same day. Sometimes you might have to put some gap in between, and it doesn't happen every year. Some people live in properties for longer. Sometimes you might have to evict a person, and it might be 3 months with no rent. But a good rule of thumb is about a 1% vacancy factor. I'm sorry, that's not true. It's 1 month out of every 24, right? So it's about a 0.5% vacancy factor. Well, 0.5% of 2,000 is probably going to be a very small amount that doesn't need to be accounted for too much. However, one of the biggest things that's missing all this is the management. Some property owners manage their own properties. Some hire a management company. Either way, it doesn't matter because it's still either something you pay out of pocket or a job that you have to do. If you're a property owner and you have money tied up in that house, that investment in that house, you have to look at it like if you're doing it, that's a job. It may not take a lot. It may only take a few hours a month. You have to, collect the rents. You have to talk to tenants. You have to take care of things. But it is a job. Let's not even add that in. At this point, a modest $200,000 house has a hard cost, an actual cost to the property owner of over $2,000 a month, at least. Now, here's the thing. If this is in more expensive property, if it's a $300,000 or $400,000 property, it's going to be even more. But in most parts of the country, once you start getting over $2,000 and you're at $2,500 or $2,600, right off the bat, it's going to be a hard thing to rent to some tenants. Most tenants don't want to spend much more than $2,000 or $3,000 a month. We're already at $2,150 for basic cost, hard cost operating expenses for a $200,000 house, and it's tough to find that house. Most houses are $300,000 or $400,000, and you might say, "Well, my house is $400,000, but the owner only paid $200,000 for it, so he shouldn't be charging me rent based on a $400,000 house if he only paid $2,000 for the house." Maybe not. His expenses might only be based on $200,000. If he got a mortgage for, purchase price at $200,000 and his taxes and insurance are based on $200,000, that's great. But when a property goes up in value, the assessment goes up. So your insurance is going to be higher, your taxes will be higher. So there's another factor involved. If you have a house that you pay $200,000 for, and now it's worth $400,000, and you're only renting it for a value that's equivalent to the $200,000, well, you have $200,000 of cash, of equity, that's just sitting there. If you don't raise your rent up to what the value would be at $300 or $350 or $400 at least, that cash is just sitting idle. You might as well sell the building, right? Because $200,000, even if you take out $20,000 a year, that'll last you 10 years without the headache of renting out the property. So you have 10 years worth of rental income without any expenses if you just sell the property. That's why property owners raise their rent up based on the current market value, because if they didn't, there would be no reason to keep the property. Just sell it and take your cash out, right? Now, is this fair? Is this socially responsible? Is it equitable? That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about math. And the reason we're doing this is not to say who's right or wrong. It's to say, here's how the math goes into determining rental on a property. Do some landlords take advantage of markets and charge too much rent? Absolutely. Do some landlords not maintain a property? Certainly. However, the landlord, property owner, whatever you want to call it, they have made a significant financial investment, whether it's taking out a mortgage or paying cash, either one, in that property. And think about it. If your house is worth more than $200,000 or $300,000, even if it's a unit in an apartment complex, that complex might be a $10 million complex. If you divide it up by the number of units, each unit is probably worth a couple $100,000 in value. This is how it's calculated. And if you are a renter, a tenant, it may not seem fair to jack up the rent. It may not be reasonable to jack up the rent, but this is why it happens. And again, it's not an opinion about what's right or wrong. It's more about seeing how the math works so you can see it from a math standpoint. Not a math of somebody trying to get rich. Maybe they are getting rich, but it's a math of what are their costs. They have to pay taxes, insurance, mortgage, many other fees. Might be a HOA. There might be other expenses that go into it. If there's any utilities included, they have to pay that. Usually utilities are not included on rents anymore. But this is how it's calculated. Again, are there excessive markups? Sometimes there is. However, there is math that goes into it. And as a tenant, this is a very important thing to look at. It's a good reason to look at becoming an owner. It may not be easy. You need credit, you need money, you need down payment. But it's a reason that having that goal or having that, I guess it's more of an objective to be a homeowner is important, because once you buy a house, your rent is, your mortgage or monthly payment is locked in. It's not going to go up. taxes might go up a little bit, but your mortgage payment is going to stay the same. You're never going to get a rent increase every year. You're never going to be evicted, worry about getting kicked out because, the property owner wants to rent to somebody else. You have a mortgage. You're in that house. Maybe hard to do, and it's going to require a lot of sacrifice, but the math that's behind rental rates is really something that's not a subject to opinion. It's whatever the math is. An owner, a landlord, is going to mark it up. They're going to put a profit in there. If their cost is $2,100, they're going to rent it for $2,500, $2,800, maybe $4,000. Maybe it's too much profit, but there is a base amount that they have to pay that they can't go below that. That's why when a municipality or state or some other organization puts in rent control into the law, it's actually going to reduce the number of rental units, because if the potential property owner or landlord does the math on this calculator and says, look, my cost is going to be X, Y, and Z. The city or county or state says there's rent control. I can't put the rent more than this. I do the math. It's not worth owning this building. I'll go on to the next one. So it's going to take away a lot of property from the market and keep the number of rentals available at an artificially lower rate. It's going to help keep people from getting priced out of their apartment, but there will be an unintended consequence, side effect of not having more rental units come on board, because investors or owners are just not going to put money in if they don't see it happening. That's where maybe the government needs to step in and own property, but they're going to need to manage it and do the same math, because if they don't, the government's going to lose money too, and it's going to have to come out of schools or other public sector expense areas of the budget. Look, we're not trying to pick sides, right? We're not trying to say who's right or wrong. We're just doing math. And if you are a renter or a property owner, put your comments below. Let us know what you think. It's not personal. It's just a matter of what the math is. And if you're in a position where you're renting a place and the rent got jacked up, look, your landlord might be taking advantage. They might be doing something totally unreasonable, but there is some math behind it that supports some level, maybe not the level that they're asking you to pay, but there is some level that's important. It can't go to zero, and it can't go down to what it was, let's say, 10 years ago.